My name is KELLY ANERUD. I am Deputy Director at IFAC, responsible for the Intellectual Property, Translations, and Permissions Department. Welcome, benvenuti, to this new session on translations, translating international standards and guidance, best practices and tools to achieve quality translations. This is a groundbreaking initiative. It's the first time we've ever had a session like this at the World Congress, and we're delighted to see all of you here. In fact, we had to change the room venue that was originally planned for us because more people signed up for the session. So thank you so much for being here. One of IFAC's important strategic initiatives is to support the global adoption and implementation of the international standards. Having high quality and widely accepted translations of the international standards in the relevant languages is an essential element to effectively achieving adoption. So this session will provide information and best practices about how to do this. I'd like to introduce my fellow speakers. First of all, we have Hilde Bloem. Hilde is Deputy Chief Executive of the Federation of European Accountants. She brings to our session a perspective of one region and many languages. There are 24 official languages in the European Union, and in fact, FI has other member bodies that represent languages in addition to those 24. So, bienvenue, Hilde. I'd like to introduce Javier Quintana. Javier is the Chief Executive Officer of the Instituto de Censores Jurados de Cuentas de España, IFAC's member body in Spain. Javier also has a key role in the Ibero-American Spanish Translation Project. He brings to our session a perspective of one language spoken in several regions and in many countries. Spanish is an official language in more than 20 countries throughout the world. Bienvenido, Javier. And Maria Rita Cafulli. Maria Rita has been the head of the translation department of our host, Consiglio Nazionale dei Dottori Commercialisti e degli Esperti Contabili, since 2006. In regard to our session today, Maria Rita is our expert on translation tools and techniques and brings a perspective from translating a wide variety of IFAC publications, including the international standards. Benvenuti, Maria Rita. Just to speak briefly about the structure of our session, I'll proceed with an introduction and provide you some feedback about the survey that we ran this summer in preparation for this session. We'll then proceed with presentations from Hilde, Javier, and Maria Rita. I'll provide a brief summary following that, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. One piece of administrative information: there are dedicated buses for this session to take us to the social dinner this evening. So once the session is concluded, you can proceed leisurely to the area where the buses depart without having to stress and leave early to return to your hotels. So that's been arranged by our host specifically for our session. Let's look at IFAC's Translation Challenge. According to ethnologue.com, there are currently 7,106 living languages. That statistic amazed me. In terms of native speakers, Chinese is the most widely spoken language, followed by Spanish. English is only number 3. With approximately 180 member bodies and associates in 130 countries, IFAC and our profession are truly global. Over 100 of IFAC's member bodies and associates operate in a language other than English, and they represent 55 different languages in total. So as such, this session should be highly relevant for many of them. And the International Standards on Auditing, the ISAs, have been adopted in 100 countries and have been translated into over 45 languages. And you'll find those translations on our translations database, or at least we'll direct you to where you might be able to access those translations. And the website link is provided on this slide, and all the slides will be made available tomorrow. Accounting is really the global language of business and finance. But in regard to IFAC's strategic objective of supporting adoption and implementation of the international standards, how can countries effectively adopt those standards if they don't have them available in their native languages? For IFAC member bodies, although the statements of membership obligations do not require translation of the international standards per se, they do place responsibility on IFAC member bodies to assess whether translations are needed, and if so, to support translation efforts based on the particular role that they have in their jurisdiction. And this may mean that the member body actually performs the translation, or it might mean that they support an adopting authority in performing those translations. There are currently 2 policy statements that guide IFAC's work in regard to translation and reproduction of the international standards and other IFAC publications. Many of the elements of these 2 policy statements are similar, but the translation of standards policy statement has some specific requirements related to the translation and review process. The policy statement is based on cooperation between IFAC and a translating body. It provides for the effective and efficient utilization of limited resources, but relies heavily on the goodwill of translating bodies and the fact that quality financial reporting and auditing is of interest to all. So in terms of the translation of standards policy statement, there are several objectives and a few points that I would like to point out to you specifically. The first one is to strongly encourage, one quality translation of the standards per language and avoid multiple translations into the same language, which often creates confusion among users and raises questions as to the authority, which translation prevails. The second point is to achieve a faithful translation of the standards. Now, a faithful translation is not necessarily a literal translation, but it's a translation that respects the intent, tone, and organization of the final standards in English and enables those who wish to read them in a language of translation to obtain the same understanding of their meaning as that of a similarly qualified native English speaker. And this naturally helps to ensure consistent global adoption. The third point, to achieve a widely acceptable translation. And in that regard, the use of a review committee that represents a broad group of stakeholders is important. And the composition of a review committee will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but often includes, naturally, the translating body. It may include representatives from the international firms, small and medium practitioners, the national standard setter, adopting authorities, other member bodies that use the same language, accounting experts, the public sector, academics, even linguists. But keep in mind that it's important to have one that's manageable in size. So this is a decision to be taken for each jurisdiction performing a translation. What's the appropriate composition of the review committee to ensure wide acceptability of the resulting translation? 4, to achieve a timely translation of the standards and ensure that it's regularly updated and that the translation process is sustainable. And 5, to help ensure good practice in regard to IFAC's valuable intellectual property, as many of our member bodies contribute valuable resources to developing the standards and to also performing those translations. And we allow many of our member bodies to reproduce and sell their translations in order to help them recover the cost of translation. And one important distinction to make is that while the international standard setting boards operate in the public interest, and IFAC has the public interest as one very important element of its mission, the English language standards and publications and the translations are generally not public domain. They're copyrighted publications, and IFAC makes them available through terms of authorized agreements with interested parties. This is an overview of the Intellectual Property Translations and Permissions section of the IFAC website, where you'll find various resources such as the IFAC policy statements that I just mentioned, frequently asked questions, our e-news, the translations database, and most recently, formatting guidelines for translated handbooks and publications. And I have a few copies of those to hand out at the end of the session. And if there are not enough to go around, please access them via our website. It's on this page where you can submit inquiries or requests for reproduction and translation via our recently launched online permission request and inquiry system. This system also allows you to manage all your requests in one place, to duplicate existing requests to save time when placing new ones, and also to view the status of your pending request. And Maria Rita will be informing you of another exciting online resource that we've recently launched to assist the IFAC translator community. For those organizations wishing to become an IFAC-designated translating body and translate any IFAC publication, including the international standards, the first step is to submit a permission request and translation proposal and enter into a translation agreement with IFAC prior to starting any translation. It's important to note that through the terms of the agreement, copyright in the translated material is always assigned to IFAC to allow us to facilitate global adoption. This slide shows the key roles and main steps in the translation process as described in the relevant policy statement. I will not go into detail about these, as you can consult the policy statement for further information, and this topic will be addressed by one of my colleagues in subsequent presentations. Thank you very much for participating in the online survey this summer that helped us prepare for this session. I would now like to provide you with a very quick overview of the results in order to provide some context for the presentation of my fellow speakers. We were very encouraged to have received 56 responses representing 41 countries and 35 languages. Spanish, French, and Russian were the most widely represented languages. In terms of size, a little over half of the respondents represent organizations with over 50 employees. Many different types of IFAC publications exist and are being translated, but most organizations are translating the international standards and related guidance publications. And those related guidance publications are most often the ones of the Small and Medium Practices Committee, such as the ISA Guide, the Quality Control Guide, and the Practice Management Guide. Most of the respondents said that they use an in-house translations department or an outside professional translator. And this is often a professional accountant, for example, a retired partner, or similar appropriately qualified professional with relevant experience. Approximately 2/3 of the respondents said that they use translation memory software, and 1/3 do not make use of this valuable tool. So what tool are they using? And those that are not using translation memory software, why not? Most said that they use Trados. Trados is developed by SDL. It is the translation memory software that's also used by the European Commission and by the IFRS Foundation. The references here to Google Translate are somewhat worrying, I guess, in regard to translation of the international standards, which clearly is highly technical material, but we'll come back to that later. The reasons cited for not using translation memory software tools would seem to relate to lack of awareness about what tools are available, or possibly misperceptions related to their cost, quality, or relevance. And Maria Rita will provide more insight and helpful advice in this regard during her presentation. Approximately 80% of the participants perform a review involving the relevant committee of the professional accountancy organization, possibly supplemented by other relevant stakeholders, such as the National Standard Setter or the Adopting Authority. And this is in line with the IFAC policy statement. And finally, most participants do provide feedback to IFAC when there is a reason to do so, for example, with errors maybe in the English language version or questions about translation of terminology. So that's very good. And we do pass those on to the international standard setting boards, or we respond to them ourselves as appropriate. So building upon the survey results, you'll now have the opportunity to hear relevant experience, insight, and tips from our colleagues. We encourage you to listen and engage so that we can together progress this important activity to enhance global adoption and implementation of the international standards in the public interest.